Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rebecca Snyder with the Maryland, Delaware, DC Press Association. I am delighted to partner with the Local Journalism Initiative of Delaware to bring you the second part in our series of Delaware FOIA. So today we'll be talking about what happens when the other shoe drops. What happens if and when your FOIA request is denied, and strategies that you can employ to get that information. So with us today, we have Xerxes Wilson from the News Journal, Jim Lee from DNR and a former newspaper editor for many years, and Lauren Russell of Ballard Spahr. I'll let each of them introduce themselves more fully, but then and we can get into the meat of the matter. As you know, this is being recorded. It will be available on our MDDC YouTube channel. Since we're a cozy group, feel free to put questions in chat or just break on in and ask as the discussion continues. So welcome, everyone. Why don't we go around and just, because we'll start in the upper left-hand corner and rotate around. Xerxes, you want to introduce yourself first, Jim, and then Lauren?
Sure. My name is Xerxes Wilson. I cover primarily courts and a great deal of prison stuff for the News Journal and DelawareOnline.com. I've worked for the Journal for 7 or so years. I started out covering county government. Some people on the panel might remember Tom Gordon's administration in Newcastle County government and filing FOIAs, dealing with that. These days, my work pertains largely to FOIAing things that are I guess parallel to courts and litigation, things like government settlements, stuff like that, as well as whatever I can get, very little, out of the state's prison system, which also kind of falls within my beat and interests. And I'm glad that we're having this conversation.
Great, thanks. Jim?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Welcome, everybody. I worked in news for 30 some years, various roles. The last one was at the Dover Post in Dover as their editor. And then I moved to DENREC, and I am the Community Resource Officer for the Division of Climate, Coastal, and Energy within DENREC. So over the course of my news years, I had the opportunity to work with lots of awesome people in government who always readily provided Freedom of Information Act request information to me, and were truly awesome people. And then I also got to work with some other ones who were, let's say, a little more reluctant. So I've sort of dealt with it all. And now I'm on the other side of the fence, and I'm trying to make sure that any requests that come to our division anyway are answered to the fullest extent possible.
Great. And Lauren?
Hi, Lauren Russell. I'm with the firm Ballard Spahr in the media law group. I actually started off my legal career. I was in Delaware practicing corporate litigation. And so now I am representing publishers, and my practice is defending against defamation claims, and then also bringing lawsuits against government entities for access to public records and court proceedings. And I am currently based in DC, but do have a fond place in my heart for Wilmington. And funny enough, I'm actually from Wilmington, North Carolina, and then I lived in Wilmington, Delaware. I don't know many who have a double Wilmington.
I do.
Really?
Yeah, strangely enough, yes.
It's a theme.
Good to meet my fellow double Wilmingtoner. So
That's funny. That's great. Yes.
Well, that's terrific. So Allison, you're important in so many ways to provide the double whammy and support at the Local Journalism Initiative.
yeah,
So
critical additive role. So
absolutely. So our time together is really going to be spent talking about what happens after the request is filed. And so we talked in our prep call, we really thought that there were kind of 4 main avenues if something's denied. You could one, look for the information in another area. Two, you could narrow your request or work with a custodian in some way. Three, you could appeal to the Attorney General's office, or four, you could file a lawsuit. And before we kind of jump into that 4-pack, I thought since we have Jim Lee here in the virtual, it would be helpful to better understand, like, what happens to that request after it gets filed. So if you could peel back the curtain a little bit and let us know, well, what does that email do, knowing that your division is not everyone, you just speak directly for DENREC, or your experience at DENREC.
Right, and actually, we're not even all of DENREC. I'm just one division within DENREC, but it's generally the same. And when the requests come in, they get directed. And actually, from a starting point, if you know and you're positive of who the custodian of record is, that is helpful to put on there. We get some requests that are just, I want all the information you have about X topic. And then the officer for DENREC has to try to figure out who within our many divisions might have that information. So if you know the specific custodian, that's better, that's more targeted, and it will cut down the time it takes to find. I get requests coming through our system, they'll send out and they'll be like, hey, does anybody have any of these records? And they'll send it to multiple divisions because they don't know. I mean, you got to figure the FOI person does not know every record holder and what it is. So the more you can target it, the more you can get it to the person quickly, the quicker you're going to get a response one way or the other. When I get a request, I send it out to our section administrators, the climate section, the coastal section, and the energy section, and I'll send it out to each of the administrators and say, do you have records that are responsive to this request, and give them the deadline. And then they let me know if they do or they don't. And then I put that information into the database and say, okay, we have the records and we're going to get them to you, or we don't have any records that are responsive to that request. If we don't have any records responsive to the request, that's it. That's the end of my involvement. If we do, then we go and get them anything that is public record and get them out.
It sounds to me like this goes back to something that came up in our first section, is to always try and make things, a little bit clearer and easier so that you're easily responded to. So I think we've all been on emails that have, 20 people on them, and nothing really ever happens when you're sending to a group that large because there's no responsibility. So if you know the information on where to target it, that's always a good choice to help the custodian out. So Jim is trying to fill as many requests as he can. Let's now turn to what happens when that request isn't filled. And so Xerxes, you probably have that painful thing happen most out of the group assembled on the call. Tell us what your strategies are when you get that denial.
So typically the denial will come in an email that says either the records you're looking for or the records that you have asked for don't exist, or they're being withheld, and will cite one of the exemptions laid out in FOIA law. And those exemptions are kind of broad. It's not like this kind of specific document will be withheld. They're more just categories of documents. And from there, like, those categories are laid out in the law, and it's up to the FOIA coordinator and their legal counsel to determine whether or not what you're looking for fits within those exemptions. So my strategy typically is, when I get that rejection, is just to ask for more information. I'm not really clear on whether or not I don't know what the legal standard is in terms of what level of information they need to provide is as far as the rejection. But I'll ask, like, okay, if they don't cite a specific exemption for withholding something, I'll ask them, okay, well, what are you withholding this under? And then sometimes I will ask for something I know exists, and they'll say, well, these records don't exist, or they'll say, this encompasses all the records, but what I'm looking for or what I know exists is not within what they provided. So I asked, well, like, what about this? You know, what about this specific document? And like a kind of more tangible example of that is a FOIA, DINRAC and several other agencies, and this wouldn't have been Jim's division, for settlement agreements that come from litigation. Government gets sued, they settle with individuals. Those settlement agreements are generally considered public in Delaware. In that particular request, DINRAC sent me a link to a section that was all their enforcement orders, which is when they tell an entity like, you have to clean this up, or you have to stop emitting this, or you have to stop doing something. It didn't contain any kind of like legal settlements dealing with like employment matters and stuff like that. So I got that rejection. They said the matter was closed, and I just emailed the FOIA coordinator back and like, I think there's some settlements that are not captured by your response. And that prompted the FOIA coordinator to be like, oh yeah, you know what, you're right. Which it's actually a longer story than that. But eventually I got the information I was looking for. So the first thing I always do is just try to ask for information like, okay, what are you withholding? Why are you withholding it? And what is your legal justification for doing so? Because that will help you kind of further along in the process if you're going to file an appeal or something like that. Any kind of information you can get. And it's, you know, it's laid out in law that FOIA coordinators are supposed to kind of foster, I think foster cooperation is the term in the law. So and kind of how they react or respond to that digging for more information is really down to individual FOIA coordinators, but I find sometimes it's quite, or most of the time it's quite useful just to ask for more information on precisely what is being withheld and why it's being withheld.
You know, it strikes me in what you're saying is sometimes it's like you have to cultivate a FOIA coordinator like you would a source. You know, you're kind of building the relationship, you're asking follow-up questions. Is that totally off base in the way you see it, or
A little bit, not off base. No, that I'd agree with that generally. You don't really have a lot of interaction though with individual FOIA coordinators because I'm not sending a FOIA request to DINRAC's legal team every week, or I'm not sending a FOIA request to any other state agency on like a, you know, like a weekly basis, where I'm like, hey, it's me again, you know. But you definitely like through the process, even before you get to the rejection, it helps a lot to have a conversation with them as much as you can beyond just a general request, and as much as they will engage you, because there have been other situations where I've been rejected, filed an appeal, and this one is specifically Delaware State Police, filed an appeal, and they're like, oh, well, actually, we misunderstood what you were asking for. And I was like, well, you could have clarified maybe a month ago. And, you know, the thing gets resolved from there. You know, whether or not they said that in good faith or not, I don't know. But yeah, it definitely helps to have a conversation with the FOIA coordinator, because they are kind of like the gatekeeper. And just making sure like they know the full scope of what you're looking for, and also just that they know that you're serious about getting it. And if they tell you no, you're going to not simply take that and shy away or just take it, you know, take it at face. They have to have justification for rejecting you, and it's important that you show that you are engaged and you are willing to kind of push that.
right? And so kind of keeping track of all these little bits and following up and making sure that you're asking questions and engaging. This strikes me, Lauren, as like all the little bits of information that you would need to file an appeal or do a lawsuit. And I'm also just thinking, perhaps at my own desk, I'm feeling a little seen here where, you know, there's all my to-dos on little scraps around. Like, how do you guys all keep track of those, of where you are in the process with denials and follow-ups? I mean, Jim, you, I think at one point held the record for the longest extant FOIA request, FOI request in Delaware that lingered for years. So, you know, like, how do you guys keep track of all the bits and bobs in your world?
I keep a spreadsheet. that simply says on this date, I requested X from this entity. And I'll have like a little notes filled out beside it. And that helps me keep up with the deadlines for when they're to respond. And then once the appeal begins, it helps me keep up with the deadlines for when DOJ needs to respond to my appeal. And then ultimately it helps me remember, oh yeah, I asked for that before. It was rejected under X exemption. So I keep it in a spreadsheet typically, and how well that spreadsheet is kept up to date and curated is, you know, comes and goes, but that's how I try to keep up with it.
Okay. And Lauren, I mean, your life is probably deadlines and filings and things like that. Do you have suggestions on how, because your expertise really comes later in that process with, you know, whether you're writing an appeal or whether you're helping with a lawsuit, what types of information do people need to kind of keep at the ready to help bolster their case later on?
Well, so to Xerxes' point, the more communication you have, the more back and forth you have to just make sure you're on the same page is very helpful. So to have it be obvious that you were clear in communicating what you wanted, and they were clear in communicating that it was exempt or they didn't have the records, that's going to be helpful moving forward. And then, so in terms of options, when you want to call your lawyers, so you may actually bring a lawsuit in Delaware after 60 days of a denial, or even we have what's called constructive denials, where you don't hear anything and you don't have any records. But then the other step before that is you could petition to the AG and to say, ask if they were wrong in the AG's opinion and denying your request. And that's a nice, easier option. It's going to be a bit cheaper. It puts the burden on the state agency to explain themselves a little bit more. And I think Jim and Xerxes can speak more to their experiences on how helpful that has been. But if there was a violation, if the AG determines there was a violation, one can imagine that the agency would just provide the records. But the alternatives at that point, the AG can sue on behalf of the requester, or you can sue when you have a great thing in your back pocket saying there was a violation and it should make the judge's job easier. And then, so in terms of the realities of how lawsuits go, of course, it costs money to pay an attorney. And sometimes it takes a long time to get things litigated, months or longer. And so the one thing with Delaware's FOIA statutes, some states have compulsory, if the court determines that the agency violated the FOIA law, then the state agency has to pay the requester's attorney's fees. Unfortunately, Delaware's is discretionary, so the judge may order the agency to pay the attorney's fees, but which it's hard to gamble on that a lot of times. So I appreciate that, you know, you probably need to consider whatever you pay your attorneys a sunk cost. Wouldn't guarantee on a discretionary award, but that's the other option, though, is if you are aware that you and other newspapers are interested in the same articles, public records, then you can form a coalition, and that can help reduce the cost for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think so that's your comments are really more around when it's appropriate to file a lawsuit and how to lessen the cost. And, you know, when we were doing our prep call, I think it's interesting that there's not a lot of people in Delaware who are filing records lawsuits. So it's that kind of shows that Delaware is not promulgating a lot of sort of directives or regulation based on legal precedents. So it feels like the AG kind of is shaping that with their amendments and their appeals. So I want to get back to the lawsuit piece of it, but before we do that, I'd love to know whether the appeal process is a meaningful appeal process and how that works in practice. This session, the series is specifically about Delaware, and of course, every state has its own public records law. And this is, I don't know if it's super unusual, but Delaware is the practice of being able to appeal in this formal way to the Attorney General is not found in states like Maryland and so forth. So tell us a little bit more about that, because it might be a wrinkle that people who are not used to Delaware may not be aware of. And can you do it by yourself? Or do you need an attorney to file the appeal?
So you can do it by yourself, and it's actually on the Delaware AG website. There's an archive of opinions, and it's also helpful to take a look at that anyway. If you're coming up against a wall, you might be able to search and see if this issue has been presented before, and then it's really great and quick if you can find something that's on point and send it to the FOIA officer and say, actually, I think you're wrong about this. So yeah, that is a really good resource that, like you said, not honestly most states have. So, at least in the first instance, it's a good stop. And of course, it takes a little time for the AG to issue a decision, but Xerxes and Jim, what's your experience?
Yeah, I was not very successful in the appeals that I filed to the AG's office. One had to do with, well, both of them had to do with things that you would think would have been very simple, and they weren't. And the AG basically said, no, they're okay. They don't have to give you that information. And I was like, okay, fine, whatever.
Well, and so in the comments, I just put the link to the AG's opinion, and like shout out to both Xerxes and Denrick, I guess. Like Xerxes' letter is front and center right up there, but just a quick scan down, like decided, did not violate. I'm kind of searching, like, is there anyone where, here's one, November 16th, something the committee did violate FOIA. And that's an open meeting. So
We see it from time to time where the AG will be like, actually, but I guess kind of answer the question. When my colleagues or anybody ask me like, well, I got rejected, what do I do? I always tell them to appeal. It costs nothing. B, you don't have to be an attorney or a genius to do it. Like, it is as simple as an email saying, here's what happened. Here's what the law says. This is why I think it's bogus. And I've had, I don't know, like what my batting percentage is, but we've had some successful ones. And to me, it is, I guess, cathartic in a way, if that's the right word, because I don't like being told no. And I think government should be transparent in its business. And I think a lot of times they will reject your request because they know a bad story is coming down the way. And they're trying to keep you from that. And it gives me a little bit of solace to the process does, because you will shake new information loose. The AG, like the process is you file your appeal. And it can be as simple as it's just an email. You don't need an attorney. You don't need anything. You don't need to be a legal expert. You need to read the law a little bit, cite from it a little bit, and tell them why you think this stuff should be open to the public. And from there, the agency that rejected you will have a chance to respond. And that often gives you some information about what exists, what doesn't exist, and why they think it shouldn't be legally a public record. I find that very helpful. And the appeal also, like I think I mentioned earlier, it'll shake things loose in that Like, I filed an appeal I got rejected again for police settlements with DSP. And when I filed the appeal, the FOIA coordinator was like, "Oh, can you pull back that appeal? We're going to give you what you're looking for." So that can shake things loose. And really and this is kind of being litigated, or has been litigated recently with a lawsuit dealing with FOIA, but the burden of proof is on the government to justify rejecting you, to justify their withholding of documents. And precisely what that means is kind of like still the subject of a little bit of litigation, but there have been recent court opinions that says the public agency has to file a sworn affidavit saying this is what steps we took to determine whether or not what you were looking for was public or not. These are the people we talked to. These are the people, within the agency we asked. And I find that all very helpful. And I think it's a useful exercise. You're probably, the AG is looking at old case law and looking at the situation and coming up with a legal opinion based on that old case law. And a lot of times you are going to get rejected, or the appeal will fail. But I just think it's a very useful, cost-effective way of shaking a little more information loose and holding feet to the fire.
Mhm. Jim, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? You see it on both sides. What's been your experience with it?
Yeah, there hasn't been anything that we in our division have done that's resulted in a denial and an appeal that I'm aware of anyway. The one thing, getting back to what Lauren had said about looking at the AG opinions that are there to try to find information. One of the things that I found helpful when I was doing FOI requests, if I got a denial, and it goes back to Rebecca, the original point of go find the information someplace else. If you can find another agency that has that same or similar information available, and then you can say, well, why won't you give me this information? Because that agency has something similar and they've got it on their website. So what rationale are you using to deny my request when similar stuff is elsewhere? That was one thing that I found helpful. And it actually worked in a couple different times.
And it feels like working with public records, it's not a sort of shortcut. You have to do kind of the traditional shoe leather reporting no matter what. It's not just like a treat bar where you say, oh, give me this record, and suddenly the story, spools out in front of you. You do have to sometimes like almost do the research and the reporting just to get the records that you want. Would that be an accurate way to look at it?
Yeah, you have to. If you're getting denied, and Xerxes, I think, said quite succinctly there on, doing your homework and finding out the records that you want and everything. That's very good information to try to shake them loose and get them to give you what you want.
I feel like every little bit of information is valid, and it's certainly worth, you may even include that in your article or your story on what is, how how those appeals and denials happen. Xerxes, have you had experiences where you've kind of woven that into the fabric of your story? Does that become part of the story?
Sometimes it is the story, and I don't like writing stories like that, but when the government's hiding documents that should be public, or that, on an ethical level should be public. Yeah, I think it's very important to include that. And another point for both reporters and editors, I think people kind of misconstrue FOIA every now and then. Like, FOIA is a law that obligates government to show its work. Now, it has exemptions in it that says these types of documents, you don't have to show, you don't have to make them public. However, it doesn't say thou shalt not make them public. It is a discretionary decision by the government agency every time. And there are good reasons in some cases why certain documents are withheld. You think of like personal private information, medical information, information about, that could lead one to figure out how to break out of prison or something like that. Like, sometimes there are good reasons for withholding for withholding information. But a lot of times I can't see it. And so like I try to emphasize in my articles, and I try to tell my colleagues and everyone else that when you write about this, the government is choosing to withhold. And by the government, I mean specific officials within government are choosing most often to withhold information under FOIA, because it's not like FOIA doesn't say thou shalt not provide documents if they are exempt from FOIA. It simply takes away the legal obligation that they must do it. And I think that's very important to note, because information should be open.
Absolutely. And I do feel like there's a world of difference between shall and may. And Lauren talked about it regarding attorney's fees in litigation. When we're working on legislation, like I cannot tell you the hard fought battles that happen among lobbyists and bill drafters and advocates on like, they're going to die. Sometimes, people die on the hill of it must be may rather than shall. And it seems in some ways, we're like, wow, isn't that, nearly the same? But may is huge. And so, Lauren, I kind of wanted to go back to if someone wants to litigate, sort of what are the reasons? We've seen that, there's an appeal process that sometimes is really effective, sometimes not, but there is a process there. What would be some of the decision points if a reporter or a news organization is considering whether or not it's worth it to file a legal suit on a particular request?
Well, one big consideration is news value. Is it going to be of value to the newsroom by the time the lawsuit is resolved, which again can take months. But then the other something else to take into account is this an issue that comes up over and over again, and all you have are these AG opinions. And if it's something that it seems wrong under the statute, yet the AG keeps saying this is exempt, then that may be a situation where you can both benefit the newsroom in this one instance, and then hopefully get more information down the line when this issue comes up again in the future. And then if there is very clear case law, then that's great. But in that case, you will probably shake things out before a lawsuit's filed. And then the other thing to take into account is, again, is this something that other Delaware news outlets or even maybe some surrounding states, their newsrooms might be interested in it? And if you can gather a coalition behind it, then that would be a good one to consider. I mean, it's worth, because you have this AG option, I would recommend exhausting that first. But if you know where this is heading, then it's worth calling up your attorney or talking to an attorney to say, hey, what do you think? Is this something that would be viable and worth it? And yeah, and relatedly, I'll just mention that members of the coalition, our firm has an hour of a call per month. Or if you call in with a question, it's non-adversarial, then we can provide an hour of review and advice. And so when you're thinking about things, that might be worth a call.
Right. And so that's for MDDC members. And the way you kind of access that is just email me. We, just briefly describe the problem. And then I send it on to Lauren and the team at Ballard Spar, and Chuck Tobin, who's the partner involved most closely with us, then sort of sends it out to whomever's expertise is most needed. So that's a really helpful way to go. But what I'm hearing from Lauren is that, because a lot of those AG opinions rely on existing case law, if you feel like the underlying case law has a fallacy or something that needs to be clarified or cleared up, that it's a bigger picture issue than I didn't get this one particular record this one time. You want to make sure that, it's worth the time, effort, and money that goes into a lawsuit, and certainly exhaust all your other options up until that point. I wanted to just pause for a second because we could talk forever about these things, but I wanted to see if we have a lot of wisdom in the room in terms of our participants. We've got a lot of reporters and editors. I wanted to pause for questions and also comments if there's things that have worked for some of our participants or areas that they'd like to bring forward. Pipe up, friends, pipe up. Any burning questions? Wow, you guys are like the experts here.
I have
Okay,
something I
yeah,
wanted to add on the
please.
last point that Lauren made. And this might be a little redundant, but AG opinions are based on old case law, and that case law is sometimes represents situations that are in opposite of the situation you find yourself in and being rejected. And that's been kind of like my main, I've never had the pleasure of suing the government over public records. Unfortunately, maybe one day. But that's always been my argument, that the AG is saying that, you know, police investigatory records can be withheld in perpetuity because of a 40-year-old Chancery Court opinion that had to do with a professional accreditation organization. And to me, they just don't like it, it doesn't seem relevant. Like I can see like the parallel, but the situation is entirely different, and the logic that the master and chancery at the time would have applied to that situation just doesn't fit this situation. So really, you know, it'd be awesome if there were more lawsuits that kind of made that we had, that gave Delaware a stronger base of case law to litigate or to look at these things, so the AG is not relying on 40-year-old opinions or 40-year-old, you know, court rulings that don't really speak to the situation at hand. But it is very, very rare in Delaware for, particularly these days, for lawsuits to get filed dealing with FOIA.
Well, and I think, and Jim, I'll get to your comment in just a second, but I wanted to jump in here because we haven't talked at all about the role of legislation and literally changing the law. So when you speak about things like police investigatory records, in Maryland 2 years ago, Anton's Law was put into effect, which classifies police disciplinary records as achievable records under public records law. There's been a lot of, you know, bumps in the road in terms of how that's been rolled out and how efficacious it is. But there is an opportunity. It can sometimes be a hard one, long haul effort to literally change the law to ensure more equitable public access. And that's not something that there's been a real appetite for in Delaware, but I'm certainly, as your registered lobbyist in Delaware, totally 100% on board with seeing how we could potentially change things to make records better. But Jim, it looked like you were going to jump in there for a bit. Did you have something you wanted to add?
Not to add, actually, I had a question that maybe Lauren could help with, or somebody else. My biggest issue in my reporting days and everything else was trying to get agencies to provide databases of information. Now, Delaware has its open data portal, which has tons of information going back for years, and economic development, education, energy, all sorts of different things, which is very, very good. But there are also agencies who just don't give you the information and are like, yeah, well, our system, you can't get into our database because it's a third-party vendor and we don't know how to do it, and we can't get you the information. How valid is that as an excuse, and what can you do to get around that?
Yes. So all the time, I mean, state agencies, a lot of them have very antiquated equipment, and nobody, I mean, they don't care. So that comes up not rarely. Oh, we don't have a computer that can access this. I actually had that happen once with a clerk of court in North Carolina, say that evidence that had been submitted by the DA, well, they didn't have a computer that would be able to read a CD. So they were saying we can't provide that to you or copy it or even let you come in and watch it. So, and the solution there was a lawyer letter signed by me saying you're violating the state public records law and the US constitutional right to access court proceedings and filings. And they figured it out. So, I mean, it's not a valid excuse. If they have documents and data in their custody, they should figure it out. And sometimes, I mean, it depends on the situation. If you think it's something where you can offer a little help, say, hey, I have, I mean, you probably aren't running into a situation where it's a CD. That was a little bit ridiculous. But if you think that you might have a little bit more ability into letting you come in and try accessing it yourself, just letting you inspect in person and take notes, it shouldn't be a valid excuse, but it does come up.
Has that happened in your experience, Xerxes, as well? And is on a practical level, how have you gotten through some of that?
Just being like, it's 2022, we've got thumb drives. Like, hey, give me a break. You know, I can't think of an instance where I've like filed a specific appeal being like, hey, it's ridiculous, this idea that we can't get this data in some sort of format. I know the law speaks to it, and I know there have been FOIA opinions from the AG dealing with kind of like formats and stuff like that. But if it's a public record, the government has to make a means available for you to inspect it. And that's the fallback, really. And whether or not it takes an AG opinion or something like that to do so, like you have that in, like, that is ultimately what the law is. But I can't think of like a specific instance. I deal with that with the courts more often, but the courts aren't subject to FOIA in Delaware. They're more their own.
You've
kind
never
of
sent
little...
an FOI to the DMV, have you?
That is, I have not, but we have colleagues that have dealt with that a lot. And also Delgis for criminal record data and things like that. They seem to come up with all kinds of fun excuses. But yeah, that it, like I said, don't cost anything to file an AG appeal. I'm like, come on, guys. But sometimes those don't work out, or a lot of times those don't work out as well as you'd hope.
Well, and I do love the idea about, inspecting in person, especially now that COVID restrictions have eased somewhat in government buildings. It's certainly well worth it to be like, oh, well, you can't give me that information. I can go and look at it. So maybe that's a way around it as well. We do have a question from Katie, who has not yet had a FOIA request denied, so I'm sure her time is coming. And so she wanted to get a reporter's take on how you file a FOIA in general, crafting them so they won't be turned down. And I know we covered that, Katie. I would also direct you to our previous session on this in writing a FOIA, but Xerxes was covering Elon Musk over in Delaware court and couldn't make that session. So do you have what are your tips and tricks for crafting the FOIA request?
Well, a lot of times when I'm filing, I guess if you haven't had a FOIA rejected, FOIA something from a Delaware police agency, and that'll change quick. Typically, I try to be as specific as I can with what I'm looking for. And I guess that's the best advice. Just be as specific as you can. I don't really go into like crafting a FOIA request thinking like, okay, what are the magic words I can say in order to get this through? Like, I'm looking for a specific thing. That's what I'm asking for. And that's the words in the request. And I don't think there's any kind of magic bullet with how you word the request other than specificity. Make sure they know what you're looking for. Because if you're vague about it, it'll give them some wiggle room to say no. Or it'll just make their job incredibly difficult when they're going like, it'll make it look like you're going on a fishing expedition. And it doesn't really help them at all when things are kind of like vaguely worded. But so I guess that's the best advice I have, is just specificity. And also don't go into it with certainty that you're going to be rejected, I guess, like, or don't even necessarily think about like the possibility of, you definitely want the documents, but at the same time, like, it is like, if you feel like it's a public document, it's government's obligation to provide it. And you shouldn't like be thinking about how you can tiptoe your request or the words of your request, or the writing of your request to try to get around that. Like there should be an expectation that they provide it. So yeah, I guess that's doesn't really seem like a good answer, but just be super specific.
Well, and ask for what you want. I feel like that's a life lesson right there, Xerxes. So Jim, you are there magic words as a custodian? I mean, are there things that help your job when people are crafting a FOIA request? Or
And I think it comes down to the being specific and knowing the document that you want and who the custodian is the best way and the quickest way to get what you want.
Also, another thing, I guess, well, never mind, actually.
all right. Well, and as we're starting to wind down, any other questions or areas that we didn't cover?
I have a question, and this I'm just
Yeah.
going to ask this openly, I guess. How often and is it appropriate that state agencies cite cost before replying? How do you overcome those objectives? And I guess another part of that question might be, Jim, from your perspective, are there state directives that ask the agency to sum up how much is this going to cost us to gather this information? And how does that apply to state employees who are already being paid to do work? So hopefully,
Right. And actually that's fairly easy because it's right in the statute. How long, and I don't know off the top of my head, but it's like, you get the first 2 hours searching for records free, but if it's going to take a long time, then we need to calculate the cost and everything else. And actually in every FOI request that gets sent to me from the FOI office, it says, here, see if you have records. Remember that if it's going to take a long time to get them, or they're voluminous, or it's going to cost a lot, then you need to provide an estimate of what that's going to be to us. And we should not start that work until the person has agreed to pay whatever it is. So that is part of the process. And yeah, I mean, it's right in the law, how much time you get for free and how much, excuse me, can be charged after that.
And actually, Andy, I think you bring up a really good point, because if a custodian comes back with a huge fee, in some ways that's like an effective denial. If you're not able to afford the $10,000 or whatever they're saying, that's in effect saying, we're going to deny that.
But part of that too goes back to the specifics of your original request, because we have gotten the ones that fall into that time thing and everything else generally also fall into the category of, I want every record you have on this decision that was made going back to the time when the earth was first formed. And it's like, okay, well, we've got records that are in the archives. We've got records here. We've got records there, because they're going back. You're asking for information from 20 years ago, and it's going to take a while to get that. So if you want 20 years worth of information, fine, go ahead and ask for it, but expect it's going to take a while for them to get it. If you're really only interested in that one document or that 1 year or the last couple of years, consider maybe making it a more specific request.
Well, and I would think that that's a good strategy to sort of start somewhere. You can do multiple requests. You can say, okay, I've looked at this and now I want to go in this direction or that direction based on what you found. Was that something in your experience, Xerxes, that you've done, or is that effective for you?
Yeah. Cost is another thing that you can appeal to the AG. And also it goes back to having a good conversation with a FOIA coordinator. Like, there was an instance where I was cited like multiple thousands of dollars to figure out how much money was paid to police officers through this federal highway safety program. And so I talked to the FOIA coordinator. I'm like, why the heck is it going to take you 80 hours to, run some numbers for me? I'm like, well, actually, we have to go through these cardboard boxes and look at receipts and things like that. And I'm like, well, that's interesting and probably not how things should be working in 2022, but you'll learn a little bit. And there are very specific, well, let's say specific, there are rules in the law about what is billable time for the public agency and what constitutes legal review and how that's not billable time. So knowing that, and also maybe reading some of the previous FOIA opinions from the AG regarding fees and costs. I can't cite like the exact law right now in terms of like what they're able to charge for and what they're not able to charge for, but there's like, the law is specific to like, it has to be, you can charge for this particular type of acting when responding to a FOIA request. You can't charge for legal review. This is how legal review is defined, so on and so forth. And that stuff is also still being hammered out. Like we had a request recently where they were calling something not legal review when it was like the actual act of redaction. So we were curious, like, so you have a lawyer that tells the FOIA coordinator what to redact. So we're paying for them to go through and apply the black boxes to the document, redacting the information. But isn't that kind of legal review if you're looking over the document itself and determining, what isn't and is not redacted? Shouldn't that be considered legal review? And that I think that might be the subject of a pending appeal right now. That was one of my colleagues' requests, but that was another weird one. And so like, this stuff is with the fees and also with like exemptions, it's all very squishy. Like, and that's why getting one FOIA coordinator will interpret it one way, the other will interpret it the other way. The AG might go back to 1912 and pull a legal opinion that interprets it another way. So it's all about just kind of running through the process. It's kind of a shame it takes so long to run it through the process, and kind of a shame that the law isn't stronger in terms of saying, okay, if you don't have a really good ethical reason for withholding something, you can't withhold it. But that's, I guess that gets into kind of the legislative side of things. But yeah, if you feel like you're getting overcharged, appeal it and know the law. Look at the it doesn't hurt to appeal. And there are a ton of AG opinions dealing with fees and costs. And it can get kind of crazy with how much gets charged, in my opinion. But anyways.
Well, and so that's actually, we're 3 minutes until we're ending. So if there's no other questions, thank you for that, Xerxes and Jim. I feel like the discussion of fees is really important as well, because it plays into how to access those records. I'm assuming there's no other questions. We will have this uploaded on our YouTube channel probably tomorrow. But as we close out, do you all have any final comments or things that you want to share as we wind down?
I'll just note, and I know it's corny, but reporters and editors, when you're writing about information you've requested and when you've been rejected, I think it's very important to note that FOIA does not create an obligation. If something is exempt from FOIA, it does not create an obligation that the government agency will hold that. And any kind of writing you do about that should reflect that it is a decision they're making to withhold the information you're looking for.
I think that's a terrific point, and what a great item to end on. That, the government they're showing their work with records requests, and there are legitimate exemptions, but there's so many discretionary exemptions. It's well worth kind of pushing the envelope, creating a little bit of form in that squishiness, and using all the tools at your disposal to try and shake those records loose. If you run into issues and problems, I'm sure any of our panelists would be willing to talk with you, please feel free always to reach out to me. And I really appreciate the three of you coming on. I think your perspectives have been incredibly valuable. I've learned a lot, and I hope that our participants have as well. So thank you so much.